Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I am happy to welcome you to today's CUGC Connect with Nutanix. Going to be hearing all about a customer use case today, and I think that you'll get a lot of helpful information that will help you in your own situation. Before we get into everything, though, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping details. First of all, just want to let you know that we are recording this event, and you'll receive a link to the recording in an email tomorrow from GoToWebinar. So be on the lookout for that. Also, please be sure to submit your questions in the question panel at any time. We'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the presentation. I think we're going to take most of those at the end unless something's extra pertinent, but go ahead and type those in as you have them, and we'll keep an eye on those. And finally, at the end, I will be sending a link out in the chat to a survey. It is short and it's anonymous and for CUGC use only, so just be on the lookout for that. All right, with us today, we have Jake Walsh. Jake is a Citrix technology advocate, and he has moderated several webinars for us recently, so I'm happy to welcome him back today. Jake, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Stephanie. Great to be here and on another great webinar. So yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the questions and asking a few more at the end. So yeah, just bring your questions and yeah, we'll get those answered hopefully.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so I am about to turn you over into good hands. We have Jarian Gibson with us. He is not only a senior solutions architect with Nutanix, but he's also one of our CUGC leaders in Kansas City, and he is a CTP. And with us also is Dave Brett, also a CTP. He was one of our original founders of the CUGC Networking SIG, which was a group that put together lots of content that was networking related around NetScaler, now ADC. So I'm going to turn you guys loose and give you the screen to get us started. Dave, it's coming your way right now.
Thanks. Can you see that all right?
Yep. Yes, you're good.
You're good. Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for having us again on here. Looking forward to talking about this stuff today. We're going to do a customer use case for running Citrix on Nutanix. What we're going to talk about today, some introductions. So Stephanie's done most of that, a bit about who we are. Also just going to run through what the use case is that this presentation was based on. Do some considerations, talk about why Nutanix and what to consider before heading down the HCI route. Design, so some of the lessons learned during the design phase of it, some of the common mistakes that we or I made while doing that and how to ensure your system stays up and performant. The migrations, so one of the reasons we're all here, like we got all this new kit and now we need to get onto it. So we can go through some of the steps that we took there, some of the pain points on that, and also the easy part, and then hopefully some questions at the end, should we have time.
Yeah, so like Stephanie said, my name is Jarian Gibson. I'm with Nutanix. I'm on the EUC engineering team as a senior solutions architect. Like you said, I'm one of the co-leaders of Kansas City, one of the early CUGC groups in the US. I'm also a CTP, and I'm happy to be here to help with the presentation, add some Nutanix stuff to it, and also go through his customer use case.
So as Stephanie said, my name's Dave Brett. I'm an EUC architect for a healthcare provider here. Do a lot of stuff in the CUGC space with the networking SIG, also a CTP along with Jarian, and been a Nutanix NTC for 3 years now, I think. So the customer case. So I work for a large healthcare provider here in the UK. We have a reasonably large Citrix virtual apps and desktops platform. It's grown a lot recently with everything that's going on around the world. We have a global Citrix deployment spanning more than 12 countries. Around probably 6,000 concurrent users, and the platform, because it's globally, needs to be up and running all day, every day. Otherwise, some examples of if things go wrong, like payments get missed or there's an outage, some of the customers don't get food delivered. Historically, we've always had a traditional 3-tier approach to virtual apps and desktops. However, we went through a migration plan from our on-premises data centers to a third-party managed DC, and there was a lot of business-driven compute decisions made around that migration as part of the cost model that we went to, and some of this didn't necessarily sit well in the EUC space. So what we had to look at is re-architecting the solution. The end goal for us was to have a scalable, performant, and more importantly, a simpler solution. One of the reasons for that is we had less hands on the tin now. Also, in a third-party DC, it takes longer to provision change, and it's harder to manage the multiple teams across different environments. Jumping in, like the considerations that we had to go down. So there are a number of things that you need to be taken into account. Some of these are business considerations. There's always cost involved, performance and scale, and also support. So if we dive into these and go into the reasons around why we chose Nutanix. So the business decisions around the platform, we get pushed down a funnel, and the reason being there's normally a book of trusted vendors that the that the business will allow you to use. And essentially for us, we had a choice of Azure Pack, which is Azure Classic running on premises, or third-party hosted VMware virtual machines. Each of those technologies for us provided its own issues around network zoning and stuff like that. So we were being pushed down a specific path, which we didn't want to go down. So the first thing we started looking at when we looked at Nutanix is what HCI could offer, what it could offer in a third-party data center. The first thing we were asked, I mean, I went to my boss, and none of the people had much knowledge of Nutanix. So the first thing that came back to us was, well, what's Nutanix? A lot of managers right now are used to traditional 3-tier architecture with your SAN, your compute, and your network, and how that all ties together, and they're comfortable with that. When you start talking about hyper-converged stuff and no need for like the storage teams to be involved and less movement around the racks, then they kind of get confused reasonably quickly. So Jarian will just explain a little bit around what it is that Nutanix offers.
Yeah, so Nutanix is a hyper-converged infrastructure, and what we do is we take these things like multi-cloud management, app automation, orchestration, virtualization, your server, your data protection, your storage, and networking, and we collapse that into a hyper-converged product. So if Dave just clicks here once for the animation to go through. So we're taking this full stack here on the left and collapsing that down into a simplified architecture to run your applications on, your VMs on, and in Dave's case, this was his Citrix infrastructure to be able to migrate from his 3-tier architecture into a hyper-converged platform. And some things like Dave liked was the single pane of glass management, the integrations with Citrix, being able to move from PVS to MCS, so taking advantage of things like our shadow clones in data locality. And those things were attractive to Dave and to his healthcare provider that he works for. And then, so how does this work? So typically with EUC use cases, we start off with 3 nodes. And then with those 3 nodes, again, it's a combination of compute and storage. And as you scale out your compute and your storage, our controller that runs on the same hardware on each node As you scale out, you get more compute, you get more storage. You can have a mix of hybrid storage, which is a mix of flash and spinning, or you can have all flash. A lot of customers for the EUC workloads, are perfectly fine with using hybrid, so the mix of flash and spinning. Some customers who may have more higher demands do go all flash, but majority of our customers on Nutanix start off with the hybrid approach for their EUC workloads. The nice thing here is that you can start off with 3, and then after you start off with those 3 for your EUC use case and Dave's use case at Citrix, you can then add 1 node at a time and get the same performance and predictability of scale as you scale out from the first day to the next day, where Dave has started off with a certain sizing, and then Dave has added as he's increased his usage of the environment. Again, we have data locality to keep all the reads and writes local. We can mix hardware in different generations. Also, too, with MCS, we have shadow clones, so all the reads and writes are local to help MCS scale to get past some of the concerns that people have when they use MCS on traditional 3-tier architectures.
So moving on to the next consideration we had, which was cost. There's obviously hardware costs. So you have like hyperconverged versus traditional infrastructure. One thing to point out, Nutanix, it's not like a cheap replacement for traditional infrastructure. When you speak to some people, they're like HCI, well, everything's in one box. That's going to be cheap. What you do get is you get all your eggs in that Nutanix basket in terms of vendor spend. The cost is comparable, or for us at least it was, on the hardware. But when you consider that this hardware comes with terabytes and terabytes of performance storage built into it, when you're looking at your 3-tiered stuff and you put your hardware cost with your storage cost, then it stacks up pretty well. Hypervisor licensing, so this is a cost consideration, which we went through. Nutanix can run on ESXi, Hyper-V, XenServer, AHV. There are costs around Hyper-V and VMware. You've also got limited costs on XenServer, but with AHV for us, certainly that was a no-brainer. Storage costs, so traditional versus HCI storage. So the cost of the huge SAN arrays for EUC, as a result of us moving from traditional 3-tier back to onto HCI, we were able to give back just shy of 38 terabytes of pure SSD storage back to the business. And we, just by migrating onto HCI, increased our storage availability by 100% at 0 extra cost. Support teams and coordination, like dealing with a traditional infrastructure in a 3-tiered, you might have one support engagement with HP, you might have one with Dell for storage, you might have some with Cisco for the networking side of things. With the Nutanix kit, that kind of comes down and you go to them for all of your hardware and storage problems, which I'll get onto support in a little bit, but they are very good. And the staff and training was something we had to consider, like the multiple teams to manage the existing hardware. That kind of went down to one team, which meant we had less reliance on different teams in the business. The other thing we needed to look at is the performance and the scale. You've got very, very specific needs for EUC workloads. You need to look at kind of generic EUC requirements, but then look very, very specifically at the CPU, memory, and IOPS, and know that your Nutanix platform, in our case, was scaled up enough to deal with the load we wanted to migrate on. Just be aware that what you provisioned may not be what you're actually using. So it's worth looking into the metrics a bit more and finding out whether all of that memory that you've given of EDA is actually in use. What we wanted was the ability to scale out at will and have a predictable performance at scale. So as we add nodes, we know exactly how many more users, how many more VDAs we can run. And Nutanix sat very well for us in that space. So moving on, Jarian will talk about scaling?
Yes. So how does Nutanix scale? So I mentioned earlier that with the EUC workloads, particularly Citrix, for this use case, is that we always recommend starting off with the minimum of 3 nodes. Now you can start off with any number, but the minimum recommended is 3 nodes, and then you can add 1 node at a time as you scale. Dave did mention they did start off with a certain size of the kit, and then over time they've expanded to more use cases and added more kit. One thing here is that, with what I do within our team at Nutanix and EUC Engineering is we go through and test, different OS versions as new Windows 10 comes out, new versions of AHV come out, new versions of VMware, Citrix on VMware, even, Windows patches, security patches, and so forth. And, we always like to say, always have data, and that's how we can say that we can actually predictably scale linearly. So when you add those 3 nodes to begin with, and when you get to that 16th, 17th, 18th node, is that your performance is going to be the same as you start to when you get to the end of your journey, or if that journey, goes further through expansion. And so that's how we can actually say that we can actually predict scalability, linear performance, and so forth going through that. And Dave has seen that with his use case as well.
Yeah, very, very true. So one thing we wanted a simple support model, and honestly, I can't fault Nutanix on this aspect. When you get onboarded, so when you order your kit and it comes in, instantly you get set up with a Slack group. It sounds kind of trivial, but it gives you instant access to the assigned Nutanix employees. So you get an SE and a technical employee, and they're assigned to your business. They kind of handhold you through the install and the config initially, and then if needs be, they'll keep coming in. So as you add nodes, they'll come in, make sure their foundation right, make sure they get put into the cluster right, make sure everything's healthy. So you kind of get a single go-to point. The other thing that you get is the support. So when you log on to the portal, you can register a new support case, and generally, in my experience at least, within about 3 hours, you're on a phone with like a level 3 engineer on a Zoom meeting, and they're looking at your environment, and 9 out of 10 times they've fixed it there and then for us, which is incredible. And it's meant the whole issue around staff training and people in the teams not necessarily knowing the product goes away, because you have that good support model to fall back on. So when we were doing some sizing, Case helped. Case Baggerman also works for Nutanix, helped massively on that. And then Jarian, who's on the call with me today, has helped many times with support, which is grateful. And then earlier today, whilst you're at home on lockdown, this arrived in the post. So you can't say fairer than that they're supporting you and sending you homemade, like, build your own burgers. And you can see there are the two SEs assigned to us, which was quite nice. Moving on, design. So I'll go through some of the stuff we had to think about, certainly when we were putting the Nutanix platform in. First, I'll start with the racking and the networking. You've got to be aware that moving to Nutanix and HCI, it may not suit your current data center rack config. There's specific requirements of the rack, just down to the nature of how Nutanix work. You need a minimum of 10 gig top of rack switching. The specific data centers that we were going into use fabric extender cards, which don't work with the Nutanix platform due to the nature of the way the CVMs talk to each other and the nodes. So that's something just to be aware of. You want to have AHV and the CVM, if possible, on the same VLAN. This is by default VLAN 0, but it can be changed. The IPMI, so your lights out management port, is also a top of rack switch, an out of band switch, and you want to use redundant switches at the top of rack. So for us, certainly we had to buy some new racks. We had to get a couple of 10 gig switches and a 1 gig out of band switch to go into that rack just to house the Nutanix kit. But what you get from that is if you consider Citrix infrastructure and how it all works, like you have storefront talking to the brokers, you've got app flow data coming in, you've got WEM and SQL data. And this isn't a Nutanix thing per se, but if you put your infrastructure in these clusters, then all that data is moving around within the same rack. You're not spanning different network segments, you're not spanning different racks, it's not going via the core switches. It removes a lot of the need for the complex firewall and network configs. We certainly had that prior to moving to this. So we had separate network zones for each like hypervisor type and bits like that. So you can limit the amount of traffic that is going out of your rack pretty much to HTTPS, ICA, and the line of business app data like Exchange and bits like that, which does give you good performance. That's just a diagram there about how we looked at the traffic, and where possible we housed most of the Citrix stuff within the same clusters and racks. Excuse me. This is just a sample config that we put in. So one of these nodes or blocks on the right. Excuse me. One of these blocks on the right here houses 4 nodes. For each node, the green cable is a single IPMI cable, which goes up to a top of rack IPMI switch. The orange and the blue cables are the 10 gig networking. They go to individual 10 gig top of rack switches. And then you have a power circuit A and B, which power these the blocks. They're NX3000 series blocks. And this is just something, you've got heavily dense switches at the top of the racks when you're using this kit. So it's worth making sure you have the space for that before you go and order a bunch of this stuff. Cluster sizing. So you want to be aware of the size of your clusters. So hypervisor choice and single points of failure is something that we're going to touch on. I'm not going to go too deeply into it. Essentially, you've got those 4 hypervisors that I said before. A couple of them have got costs associated to them. There's also ease of use and staff training, and there's functionality and single points of failure. So some of the hypervisors have got single points of failure built in. For us, the choice was pretty easy. We didn't have existing licensing in play for vSphere or Hyper-V, XenServer. We didn't really want to use the pool master method. So for us, AHV was very suited to us. Since the CVM, each CVM will run the management software. So that's distributed by design. So it's not gonna, we didn't have any of those single point of failures. Around the sizing, you got to consider the upgrade time, which sounds like kind of a trivial thing because of the way that you normally would upgrade hypervisors. Whereas with Nutanix, it's a single click upgrade. So you literally click go, and then it rolls through all of your nodes in your cluster and just upgrades them one by one. It can take a long time, so it's worth thinking about that when you're designing your cluster size. I mean, we're currently sitting at 25 nodes in one of the clusters, which is probably about as high as we would go, because an upgrade for AOS and all the supporting software takes around half a day, 3/4 of a day to get that done. With the LCM upgrade, so there is built-in firmware and BIOS upgrade capability directly into the management interface. Now they do take a lot longer because they need to boot into like a Phoenix shell to do that. And also failure domain. So you want to make sure that your failure domain isn't too big if you have like a huge cluster in there. This is just an example of how the upgrades work. So this is a snapshot from the Prism element UI. You literally log on, click upgrade software, and you can see there at the time we were running 5.11. 5.11.1 was out. You literally just click download, click run pre-checks, and then click go, and it will just go through and do it all for you. Manages moving the machines around and then moving them back when it's done. I'll try and speed up a little bit. I realise we're eating into the time. Storage design. So this is kind of what you would see normally. With 3-tier, you'd have a whole bunch of LUNs assigned to a hypervisor pool. It's all divided up. You need to zone those LUNs before you present it. For us, we wanted to reduce that complexity, and Nutanix gives you a single storage pool across every single node you have in your cluster. And then as you add more nodes, that storage pool just grows automatically with you, assuming you're not limiting the size. You define containers on the storage pool, and then you put properties against the container. Jarian, do you just want to talk about the dedupe and the erasure encoding and stuff around the storage containers?
Yeah, the main thing here, depending on your workload, persistent, non-persistent, will be depend on what you set for the containers in the storage pool for the storage. So, for example, for non-persistent, we recommend just using compression. For persistent, that's where you might want to use dedupe. Anything for EUC, we don't recommend erasure coding or EC because that's a post-process type 7 days thing. So typically it's compression, non-persistent, and then dedupe for persistent desktops.
So the other thing worth mentioning is if you're housing VDAs and infrastructure on the same cluster, you probably want to define different storage containers for each, just so that you get the best out of your storage.
And that'd be the same for persistent and non-persistent. And just to clarify, for persistent, you want to use dedupe and compression, and then for non-persistent, just compression.
So this is just a screenshot of those 15 nodes. We have 51 terabytes. You can see we're getting a data reduction of 2 to 1 on there. And there are 8 storage containers. This is just going through the settings that Jarian was talking around how you would define your storage pool, your storage container, and then set whether you want compression or not on that container. The other thing, whether you're on Nutanix or not, there are certain things that you want to do with infrastructure specifically. So for example, in Citrix storefront, you want to keep the storefront servers on different hosts. So if you do lose a host, then you don't lose a service. In all the hypervisors, you can have affinity or anti-affinity rules. The same is true with Nutanix and AHV, but it's not available. You can set an affinity rule in the UI, so you can pin a VM to a host, but you can't do the anti-affinity rule. You have to do that on the CLI. There's a bit of text up there like lack of UI. Does it really matter? It's not kind of something you set up that often. And when you're setting up, it's relatively easy. We used the Dutch user group as an example. So you'd create the VM group, you'd add the 2 VMs to that group, and then you would set the anti-affinity on the group. And then that would always ensure that the servers that you've got in that affinity group are on separate hosts.
And this would be any infrastructure VM, delivery controllers, FAS, storefront, session recording, WEM servers, etc.
And then infrastructure placement here, you do have, if you have multiple Nutanix clusters in different data centers, you can use a protection domain to automatically replicate those images. So you've got some kind of instant DR which is useful. It's useful whilst you should still back up the machines. If you need to bring one online very quickly, you can use the protection domain where it's replicating every night to another DC, which is pretty handy, and we've used it in the past. Actually, it works very well. Moving on, so depending on your license, you get different functions within Prism Central. But what Prism Central is, it's kind of like the central management interface for multiple clusters. So you have a bunch of Nutanix clusters all over the place. Prism Central will allow you to connect to and manage all of the machines on those across all of your data centers. Something worth considering is the sizing of the Prism Central machines. So you can just have one if you need to, or you can scale it out and have more than one. It does give you self-service capability. So it gives you, if you do have teams within the business that want to spin up machines, not necessarily specific to EUC, but if you have business units out there that want to present their own VMs and run them up and tear them down, then you do have the ability to do that within Prism Central. And you've also got automation with Nutanix Calm. I've used this quite a lot. I think it's quite good. What you can effectively do is use it kind of like MDT or a different deployment tool, where you can have Nutanix Calm spin you up a single or a multiple machine blueprint, and then go through and configure that. So you can deliver a service on Nutanix with a single click, which has been useful for us in the past, especially for certain components that don't like upgrades too well. You can just redeploy them over a weekend. Jarian, you got anything on Calm, or do you want me to carry on?
I'll go ahead and carry on because interest in time.
Yeah. Planning. So the other thing Prism Central gives you, it gives you scenarios and a capacity runway, which we use a lot. One of the things you can do is you can say, I want to put a new workload onto the platform. It's a VDI workload. We're going to use Zen Desktop. They're going to be developers, and we're going to use MCS with 600 users. And what it will give you is it will estimate how much time, how much load it will put onto your clusters, and how much time after you've put that load on, your cluster will carry on running if you continue growing at that rate, which is was very, very beneficial for us, especially right now where we have a load of people working at home and they want to put new users onto the Citrix platform, and we can use this to see the impact that's going to have on the platform. The other thing we use a lot is Nutanix Files. What it essentially is, it's a scale-out file server built in your HCI cluster, and it uses the same storage, which is the quickest and closest storage to your VDAs. You can use it specifically for user profiles or app V applications, as we do for streaming app V apps. They're very, very close to the VDAs. Boot up scripts and actions. It's replicated, so you can replicate it using peer software. You can also use other products out there. I'm not going to name any, but there are other very good products which will let you replicate data between Nutanix Files exports. The two types of shares you got, and we do use both, but you got distributed versus traditional. Traditional will route all of the traffic via one of the file servers. So when you build it by default, you get 3 file servers serving effectively the same network access point. If you set up a traditional share, it will go through one. If you set a distributed share up, it will load balance that through all 3. Now, there are caveats to that around top level directories. Jarian, do you want to get into that a little bit?
Yeah, so just the main thing is with top level directories is depending on the solution, if there may be some additional configuration required to work properly. A good example, and Dave is using this as well, is FS Logix, because when it goes and does, if you're not using Cloud Cache, when you initially create a profile container or Office container, it creates a test directory, and that sticks. And sometimes you won't be able to delete it by default. So there's a command that you can run to do that. Other solutions, and I think Dave is also using user layers or was using user layers as one of his use cases, is that with user layers, since it puts a extra users folder in the path, so server name, share name, users folder, then user directory, because that third folder in the extra folder in there, it doesn't distribute properly. So there are also some considerations on planning out your shares for user layers and also user personalization layers that are newer because they're the same technology when it comes to that.
And also worth mentioning that they're incredibly simple and easy to deploy in the same way that Nutanix make most of the other management UI easy to manage. Same as with the Nutanix Files. It's like a next finish type deployment. You get decent analytics out the box, so you can see how. You can see how the storage is working directly in the Prism element UI, and it gives you some fairly decent stats around throughput and IOPS and how the overall you're performing. But if you do want to go a bit deeper, you can put file analytics in, which will give you a much more in-depth view around what's going on your storage platform. This is something we've tested a little bit. We do use it in some instances. AutoScale, it's something I want to touch on quickly. So it's new with 5.11. It effectively gives you the ability to automatically scale workers up or down. It gets rid of that need for consistent like VDA tweaking. So what you can do is you can add extra CPU or add extra RAM to a VDA via a playbook. I think it's a playbook. And trigger that based on alerts. So if Nutanix picks up that your VDA is constrained, then it will scale that up for you. If it picks up that it's over provisioned, then it will pull that back, which is it requires you to put a lot of trust in it, because some of your VDAs might end up growing way bigger than you initially intended. But from what I've seen, it works very well. If you're familiar with ControlUp, is quite similar to the sizing recommendations that they have on the Prism Central interface. It will tell you which machines are constrained, which are over provisioned, and you can have a nice list and have a look at what Nutanix thinks of your environment and how it thinks you should size things. These are just some of the playbooks you can define and the alerts. Master images. So we wanted good alteration around the master images, and we wanted to be able to manage the master images across clusters. The deployment technology was important to us. We did look at app layering, whether we were going to use that for deployment or MDT to automate those builds, manual builds or Calm. Something for us was moving those images around and how we were going to go about that, and Nutanix offered something with the protection domains to help out with that, which Jarian, I believe you're going to dive into.
Yeah, so the main thing here and with Dave's use case, since he's using MCS, machine creation services, non-persistent, is how do we move that master image around? And we have protection domains or runbooks as the option. Protection domains are built into Prism Element. They're the same interface for cluster management, for files management, etc. And what allows you to do is take that master image and replicate that around to different clusters, whether they're the same location or multiple locations. So as Dave goes to the animation here, you'll see for non-persistent, you just move the master image from one cluster to the next cluster in this example, and then just run your MCS workflow from there to deploy your clones. What you do then with dedicated machines, which Dave is also doing, or persistent machines, is instead of just doing the master image like with MCS, you're doing the same thing, protection domains, or you can use runbooks in a DR scenario to replicate those to protection policies and then bring those up to recovery plans in a case of a DR situation. But because they're full clones, persistent desktops, you're replicating all those around instead of just the master image for PVS or for MCS.
So moving on to actually getting onto the platform. So infrastructure, this was the first bit that we looked at. This is generally the easy bit. Because you've got the automated builds, if you are using Citrix ADCs or any other kind of load balancer, then use networking, or we certainly use networking to assist with the migration. So you can split your storefront servers from where they are now to running on HCI and Nutanix, and then use your load balancer to move that workload over, which we did. We use Calm to help with the automated build, so we can repeat those builds consistently. We provisioned the existing infrastructure networks into the Nutanix clusters, which meant there was no issues with firewall rules or stuff like that when we were moving services over. Just a point though is remember to add the Nutanix specific components to your controllers and Citrix Director. So there are plugins that you need to put down onto your infrastructure to ensure that it's working properly.
Yeah, the main thing here with the plugin is to interface with the Citrix APIs and do the power management and the MCS process is installing our plugin on the delivery controller. Since David's using on-prem, if you're using Citrix Cloud, that will go on your cloud connectors. The main thing here is always make sure you check for the latest updates. You can subscribe to email alerts in the support portal because as things change with the APIs from Citrix or things get enhanced, we also update our plugin to include enhancements and fixes as well. There is a director plugin also to where you can see the storage performance at the machine level of the deployed machines on Nutanix to see that as well with the director plugin.
Like I said, around the capacity side of things, so during the migration, as you're pushing more and more workloads over, we were using Planner and Runway to predict the workloads before we migrated. Then once it had moved over, we'd let it settle for a while, and then you could look at the VM efficiency, make sure that everything you're running isn't running over provision, so you're not using more than what you require, or that indeed everything's not constrained. Just a quick word on that. The Prism element UI, it gives you as the home page on it. This is looking at a home page for a cluster. It gives you a very good look at how your cluster is performing right now. And you know, for the first port of call during a migration, this is where you go to look. And then worker migration. This is where, to be honest, this is where most of the work went. Because you need to consider the build method on the Nutanix platform. I mean, it's the same as building anything, a worker on any other hypervisor, but you need to make sure you have the VirtIO drivers loaded if you're using SCCM or MDT. If you are using app layering, you need to make sure that the correct drivers go in the correct layer. You do have the option to manually build it, or options around automation with Calm. For us, certainly we were moving PVS images from a Zen server environment to an MCS hosted AHV environment, so it was a little bit more complicated, not quite as straightforward, and I'll let Jarian just talk through how that works.
Yeah, so we do have a migration product tool called Move that I'll talk about here on the next slide. But for going from Zen server to AHV, we don't have that built into the tool as is today. So right now, moving from Zen server to AHV is a manual process. The main thing here is making sure that you clean up the VM from the Zen server drivers and the registry and so forth. The VirtIO, which is our drivers for AHV, make sure those are installed so when the image comes over to AHV, it has the proper drivers on it. And then basically it's mounting the storage from Zen server side, making a copy of that to the AHV side, and then basically importing that VM using our image service, and then going through making sure it comes up properly for your master image, and for Dave's case with MCS, making sure you're going through and doing the MCS process. Once you clean it up on the other side, optimize it, create your clones from there. Now, as far as other hypervisors, as Dave advances the slide here, I talked about we do have a product called Move, and so customers that are coming from Hyper-V or vSphere to AHV or vSphere on Nutanix, you can migrate that, move that over. Or if you're using our clusters, or if you want to go bidirectional from clusters to AWS or AHV to AWS, we have that capability as well. The main thing here, some tips here, if you're going to use Move, so say you're coming from Hyper-V or vSphere over to AHV, go ahead and advance, Dave. Some tips here, with interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the main thing is for Citrix, do like Dave's method. So your infrastructure, expand your infrastructure out and on the new platform on AHV, and then retire the other infrastructure on the old platform. Those are the easy ones that can be automated like Dave did. You can use your NetScaler or your ADC to swing load balance those over so there's no downtime, nothing seen from the end user side. But master images are the important ones, because if you're not fully automating those, that's where a lot of the work comes in for that. So make sure, like we saw with Zen server, clean up, remove old tools, ghost devices. One of the main things, and I've seen this with customers I've worked with, is they think that they can just migrate the image over and then just go do an MCS deployment. But make sure if you boot that up first, make sure everything works properly. I've seen some cases where you've had to reinstall the VDA after the platform change. And then sometimes with PVS, go ahead and reinstall the PVS target device software, convert that back to an image, and then go from there.
One thing on the Zen server thing, something we came unstuck with so there's a very specific like methodology to get it onto AHV. It's worth like reading that and really following it. And one of the things, when you've removed Zen tools and you've ripped out all the stuff, the ghost drivers and from the registry, and got the VirtIO stuff on there, shut it down. Don't power it back on Zen server. Shut it down and leave it off, and then migrate it. And the first boot should be on AHV. We had issues where we were booting them back up on Zen server, and it would inject certain registry keys and stuff, and then when you would power it on, move it and power it up on AHV, then it would start blue screening. So what we ended up with from old versus new, we went from 3-tier, which was difficult for us to scale, to HCI, which is incredibly easy to scale. Just in the last couple of months, with everything that's going on, we've had to scale out quite aggressively. And it's just a case of putting them in the racks and expanding the clusters, and everything else kind of works from there. You can then increase your delivery groups. We had performance issues and bottlenecks on the old platform, which we don't have anymore. There's less teams to talk to, less places for things to go wrong. We went from a complex to quite a simple, scalable solution, which is good. Support issues with multiple vendors. We've got a single point of contact for the hypervisor and the hardware now. And like big, long, convoluted upgrade procedures have gone to, kind of simple one-click upgrades, which is very beneficial for everyone on their weekend time. This is just a quote from the boss about what he thinks of Nutanix and how that's helped. And the next thing, like if you want to try it, so if you want to use Nutanix at home, a lot of people on this call will have labs. A lot of people will have, hardware kicking around at home that they run hypervisors on, and that to learn and increase their knowledge. Nutanix offer a product called CE, you can run a single node or a multiple node cluster on it, and it gives you all the functionality that you get in a production Nutanix cluster.
And just to add here real quick too, is that all the same plugins, the AHV plugin, Files, Prism Central, all that can be deployed. Like Dave mentioned, you can start with one node cluster, but you can't expand that. You have to actually redeploy the cluster if you want to add more nodes. So you can start with 3 nodes and then add a 4th node later, but the max is 4 nodes. And again, this is more lab, testing, education, development, non-production use.
Yeah. There's some resources if you need to know a little bit more about Citrix on Nutanix. Where to get Community Edition is up there. Some stuff on Flow and Xylete, which I know Jarian is involved in. And then questions.
Yeah, so we've had quite a few questions in actually. Just going to kind of pick a few ones that I think are sort of quite pertinent, probably going to appeal to lots of people in terms of the sort of challenges they're facing. One came in from a question. This was around the migration of an on-premises Citrix environment from a 3-tier VMware environment to Nutanix. The question was around the benefit to moving the management plane, so things like the delivery controllers, storefront, databases onto Nutanix. I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate a bit more on that and just cover that one off slightly.
Yeah, so for us it was to keep from, so we when you're going to like a hosted provider, for us we had different security zones for different different pieces of the infrastructure, and certainly in the Citrix world you've got like Citrix ADCs, which won't run on certain versions of Azure, or there's limitations with the on-premises versions of Azure, so they needed to sit on a VMware platform. Provisioning services needed to be on the same platform. Some storefront and licensing and WEM and some other bits needed to be on the Azure, like the on-prem Azure platform, and all of those are in different network security zones. So we had like incredibly complicated firewall rules. We had PVS traffic from being streamed all over the place, sometimes going through firewall rules. The reason we moved everything to Nutanix in the same racks on the same networks was that A, we don't have the issues with firewalls, and B, the performance of the data moving around, specifically the Citrix platform, meant it didn't have to go all the way up to the core switch, come back out, maybe go through a firewall to another machine sitting somewhere else. It was all traffic held within the rack, and the only thing we tried to design it so the only thing going out of those Nutanix racks was either ICA going to the endpoint, some HTTPS traffic for storefront, and then the line of business applications. So some of the applications have got connections to backend databases. Obviously that traffic can't sit in the same rack, but where possible we were trying to keep data locality within Citrix infrastructure as close as we could. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. One of the other questions was around so the use of sort of AutoScale with the VDA. Is that something you're using to kind of scale the environment up and down? Then obviously that's something that's kind of talks about a lot in public cloud, because basically you can save money doing it. Obviously, perhaps less relevant with an on-premises environment where you've put an upfront investment in. But how is that something you're using? How is that sort of integrated into environment?
Yeah, we use it for specific workloads. So it's something that it requires a lot of trust. So initially we looked at it and we're like, this is great. We'll just put it in because it means everything's going to always work. But when you actually get down to it, we've got some smaller delivery groups that are more admin related that do have a lot of heavy hitting apps on it, and we have playbooks to auto-scale those, and it does work really well. Right now, our main core VDA. It's not running on there because we are not making any changes to any of our platforms right at this moment. But it is something that we do have working on other delivery groups, and it works very well. So it's certainly something we'll be looking at to put in.
And just to clarify too, the AutoScale from Citrix for the cloud is different from Nutanix AutoScale. So in the cloud, they're auto-scaling the VMs to add more capacity for users. The AutoScale Nutanix is adding more resources to the VM if it becomes constrained with CPU or memory. So kind of just to clarify that as well, just so make sure we're not talking about Nutanix AutoScale and runbooks versus AutoScale for Citrix in the cloud.
Yeah. And is that something that happens kind of intelligently in terms of, and automatically in terms of, let's say if you have a shared server desktop, for example, it starts being constrained by CPU, memory. Does that machine have to be rebooted? Does it, is that sort of applied on the fly? How does that work in terms of a Citrix infrastructure?
So we've scaled machines up live.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's awesome. I think a lot of people will be very interested in that. One of the other questions that came in was around, obviously, when you went on this sort of journey in the project, you made the decision to move away from the 3-tier architecture. Did you see a big change in terms of your sort of savings to your total cost of ownership? I mean, obviously, the scalability is a big point, but in terms of if you want to plan to buy a SAN that's going to support up to a certain number, the chances are you're probably going to have to buy a control plane for it and a number of racks to host this and things, and the cost doesn't really scale linearly or in a linear fashion, I should say. Whereas obviously with Nutanix it does. So one of the questions was around the sort of total cost of ownership and the impact it had on that area.
It's made everything very, very predictable, which in our scenario is very good. So if we get requests to put 3, 4, 5 more thousand people on the platform, then we can give a very, very precise number around what that's going to cost. We know, because of the linear scale of it, we know what we can get in a rack. We know the capacity of the switches at the top of the rack. We know how many nodes we can get in, what performance we'll get out of those. So when we cost it, we cost it for everything. So the rack, the power, the switching, the actual nodes, the licensing, and you can give a very, very good price on how much it's going to cost you to scale it. Like I said before, it's not a cheap fix, but it's not, when you consider everything that goes around a 3-tier architecture, certainly in our case, like the support contracts we had to have in place, the teams that we had to interact with, the out-of-hours support, because it was a 24/7 platform. We needed people from every single team to be available 24 hours a day in case there was issues. Whereas now, a lot of that's gone away.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome. Thank you. There are a few more questions, but I'm just conscious of the time. I could stay here and ask you questions all day, but
you can put them on a mail to us, and we can certainly answer them and put like a post up on CUGC.
Yep, I can capture all of those questions for you and get those over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake, for helping out with that.
Let me get my screen back up here. Just have a couple ending slides. For some reason, I think all you can see is a white screen.
I see it now.
There we go. There it is. Okay. All right. Thank you, both of you. It was a lot of information. I hope you all learned something today. Just as a quick reminder, we do have our CUGC local events are still going on, even though we can't meet in person. We are meeting online. So today, earlier today, we had our Ireland group was meeting, and later on at about 4 o'clock Eastern, the Orlando group meets. But you can also see that we have several other groups getting together, and some of them are combining, like Columbus and Northern Indiana, and Austin and Dallas. So definitely check those out. Head over to our events calendar and see what's coming up. And finally, just a reminder, I did put a link in the chat window for you to a survey. It's short and anonymous, like to get your feedback. Also, some of you may have opted in for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. So as soon as that winner is selected at random off air, we will tweet the winner. So be sure to follow us on Twitter at myCUGC. And just be sure to check out mycugc.org if you haven't been there in a while. We've got a lot of new blog posts up. The forums are there for you if you have a question. If you have an answer to a question, you might be able to help somebody out. So definitely head over there. We've got lots of great content for you and more webinars that are coming up and more meetings. So check us out. And with that, I think I'll let you all get back to your day. Thanks again to Jarian and Dave and Jake. I really appreciate you guys being on with us today.
Thank you for having us, and thank
No
you,
worries.
Jake, for moderating, and thanks, Dave, for coming on and sharing your use case with us.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, guys. I hope you all have a great day. I hope you all stay safe, and we'll see you at mycugc.org again soon. Bye, everyone.